Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Mortensen from ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Thanks for joining us for an ALEC TV live stream. Joining me remotely is reporter Eric Boehm. He's with Reason Magazine, and I'm really excited to have Eric join us today. He wrote a story that caught our eye just a few weeks ago about what I think could have been a pretty obscure and dry research paper that came out of the University of Chicago. But Eric wrote a story that was just well written and engaging, and it just caught our attention. And it's about I think, a fascinating topic, the sale of snack foods in a public school and how that relates to sort of government policies and government regulations and attempts to ban things. So thank you so much, Eric, for joining us. We really appreciate it. You started out your piece talking about a student named Carlos, who that's not his actual name. And your opening two sentences just really pulled me in. Why don't you just set the stage for us, who Carlos is and how you started your story?
Well, sure. First of all, thank you for having me. You're way too kind and gracious, but it was, I think, it's a good story. It's an interesting story, and I opened it, and we should open this conversation by talking about how when Carlos got pinched by the fuzz, he was holding some hot commodities. They were flaming hot, in fact. Flaming hot Doritos chips is what Carlos, again, not a real student, but Carlos got in trouble for at school.
So I love that. Flaming hot Dorito chips. So what was going on? Set this whole scene for us. What were the students doing? And what was this university PhD student looking into?
Yeah, that's right. So this was a study that was done by a PhD student at the University of Chicago, looking at a high school in Chicago and looking at the dynamics that emerge kind of spontaneously within this school as students sell snacks for, a little bit of spending cash on the side. And that's what Carlos, again, all the names are fictional. The school is fictionalized. We don't actually know exactly where this happened, but Carlos got in trouble for selling hot chips to students who wanted to buy them, a voluntary transaction that took place in classrooms and hallways all throughout this high school. And the paper, I thought, really did a fantastic job of kind of drawing out the way in which a market environment operates, even under some pretty intense scrutiny, and even in a situation in which the authorities are really trying to crack down on it. And the researcher who did the paper, I think, really did a fantastic job of kind of drawing the parallels between what we sort of generally assume to be almost like a prison type environment, right? But here we're seeing it in a school where you have, just like in a prison, you have goods and commodities that are completely legal in the outside world, but as soon as they cross the threshold into the school building, flaming hot Doritos chips are outlawed effectively. They become contraband.
Yeah. So the school, I believe it was in the south suburbs of Chicago, but again, they didn't name the actual school name. This woman spent about 112 days in the school year of 2019 into the spring of 2020, just immersed in this school, watching this culture of these underground black market snack food sales, because the school had some sort of a written policy, very obscure, that most of the students weren't even aware of, that they could not sell snacks or anything on the school ground unless it was sanctioned by the school.
Yep.
So then what emerged was a black market economy where students were selling the premium snacks, as I call them. And it made me laugh because, Eric, my son, when he was in middle school, he was asking me for, Mom, can you get me ding dongs or Hostess cupcakes and the Twinkies? And I normally didn't give those to him. And I was that mom who gave like carrot sticks and celery sticks.
Sure.
Right. The worst mom ever. So I said, well, what's going on? And so finally he said, well, I can trade for them. I can trade them and get better things. And that's what made me realize that kids on their own naturally realize they put a value to things and they're going to want to trade. And he wasn't doing it for money. But these kids here in the school in Chicago, 80% were low income families. And I want to put up a screen here that just talks about one of the students, sort of what he was doing with the, just one second, what he was doing with the money. Okay, 1 minute. I'm going to pull down that banner so we can see the full graphic here. Okay. He said, the flexibility of sales was an asset to participants in after-school activities. For example, DeMarcus, a senior, sold chips and juice during the football season when his practice schedule forced him to temporarily leave his part-time job. In this way, selling snacks actually offered a potential alternative rather than a gateway to drug sales, as snack sellers had a reliable source of income without risking participation in illegal activity. So I just love that these kids were doing this in order to like be involved students. This kid needed a way to earn a little extra money when he couldn't during football season. And then what happened? How did some of these school administrators react?
Yeah, well, that's, I think, the really interesting part of the paper is about the kind of punishments that are meted out or the enforcement that goes on regarding these, illegal snack sales, or illegal is really not quite the right term, but illicit snack sales, I guess, within the school property. As the researcher Carolyn Gorski, we should mention her name, points out, that the students had designed, quote, elaborate strategies to hide sales, build networks of sellers, and develop a verbal shorthand around the market. So, a means to communicate with other students, buyers and sellers, finding ways to connect in ways where teachers and administrators, maybe if they're overhearing a conversation, wouldn't necessarily catch on, right? These are all things that we associate. These are all hallmarks of any sort of black market, obviously, but certainly of drug deals go down in a very similar way. So I think one of the interesting points here is the way in which these administrators are, their intention is to steer students away from illicit activities and illegal activities and dealing drugs, but they're sort of accidentally teaching the kids exactly how to do it, right? They're teaching the kids the skills that they would need to know out in the real world to be successful at any sort of black market deal. So that's obviously not the school's intention here, but that is one of the unintended consequences. When you talk about, enforcement, and I remember being, a school age kid, and same as your son, we would trade goodies, trade snack foods around the lunch table or in between classes. But we were using the barter system. So I applaud these kids in Chicago who have stepped it up to like a full scale market economy. They've done a great job. But then enforcement, I think, is something else that we could talk about here, because Gorski also goes into that in this paper. And it's interesting to see that, like Carlos, for example, the student we were talking about at the beginning, when he got caught the one time, it was the first time he'd been caught, and he was a freshman student. I'm pretty sure he's described as a freshman student. And so it was, his first offense, and he gets let off without any sort of serious punishment. His mom gets called, which is like the ultimate punishment if you're a 15-year-old kid, I guess. But he doesn't get any sort of more serious punishment, but repeat offenders are threatened with like in-school suspensions and detentions, things like that. So there's a sort of an escalating scale there. And again, that mirrors in kind of a warped way the criminal justice system as well. And I think it exposes, without actually having to look at the criminal justice system, it exposes some of the problems that arise whenever you're talking about, making something that is otherwise legal, illegal.
Yeah, I put up on the screen, thanks, Eric. This is from the study itself, and it's a long passage, so I won't read all of it. But essentially, this goes into describing the elaborate schemes that these students did in order to sell their bag of chips. One student would sort of distract the teacher. They'd walk by and sort of slip a $2, under the desk. And then they had code language, and then sometimes they were out in the hallways during passing periods. And then it became more open because the teachers couldn't control it as easily. And you would have students going through the hallways, you selling, and they all knew what they were referring to. And the students loved it because they had a better selection of snacks, and they could get it whenever and almost wherever they wanted during the school day, as opposed to, I don't know, maybe having to go to a vending machine or wherever if there were other alternative places. But this, like you described, I love this story because this shows how the markets work. This is a free market where people find a way to meet someone's need.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, a market at most basic level of understanding, right, is that like it's a voluntary transaction in which both parties are made better off They're going to exchange, in this case, money for Doritos chips. The one student has the money, the other student has the chips, and they both see the advantage in making that exchange. So they do. Black market's a bit more complicated. Prices typically go up because it's harder to make that exchange. The external pressures change the dynamics of that underlying market, and you certainly see that here. I think it's interesting, you alluded to this earlier too, but one of the other interesting elements of this is that the school could officially sanction sales in some circumstances, right? So there's Gorski at one point in the paper talks about how there was a Spanish club that was raising money to go to Peru. And so they were selling cookies in the hallway, and that's the exact same transaction, right? And as far as the students are seeing it, this is money being exchanged for snack goods in the hallways, in the classrooms. It's not like going to a vending machine or something. It is literally the exact same thing that Carlos and some of these other students are getting in trouble for doing. But because it's officially sanctioned by the school, it's okay. And again, I think that informs those students in a warped way about kind of the way the real world works, right? If you have a license to braid hair from the state, you are free to braid hair. And if you don't, you might get in trouble and face fines and punishments. Even though you're doing the exact same thing, the transactions involved are exactly the same. And I don't think that's the lesson we should be teaching kids. I don't think that's the way the world should work. It's certainly not the way a high school should operate.
So, Eric, we have Benjamin McGeever asks us, do you think if schools allowed these mutual sales between students, but limited to certain times, like lunch hours, would achieve the school's goal of minimizing distractions during instruction? Good question. I go ahead if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a question I would love to hear. Catherine Gorski, the author of the study, weigh in on. I bet she would have more insight, having spent time there, than I do, just sort of secondhand having read her work. But I think the question brings up an interesting point, which is the counterpoint to everything we're saying about, oh, this is a cool example of entrepreneurial spirit among students, and it's a black market that's flourishing despite the authorities trying to shut it down. Like, the counterpoint to this is that schools exist for a reason, right? And schools exist to instruct kids, and like, you need to have some base level of discipline that exists, some basic set of rules that everybody's going to agree to follow, just so you can do the job of educating. And so that is there's a line there where obviously enforcement of if it's disruptive to classes, if it's otherwise causing problems, there's I think a legitimate argument, a totally fair argument for the school drawing these lines, like the questioner, like Benjamin points out. The paper doesn't make it seem like that the lines where they were drawn were not in a reasonable place. At one point, Gorski describes the same student, actually, Carlos, being searched as he was coming in from the parking lot one day. This was shortly after he had been caught selling snacks. School security stopped him and searched his backpack as he was going into school for the day. And that's like, there's all sorts of issues there, right? There's a question of profiling. There's a question of whether that's the best use of school security. Right. Which is obviously a pretty serious question this week in particular to consider. And so, yeah, that's obviously the point, is that you need to draw those lines. You need to create an environment for learning, but it shouldn't be an environment that is first and foremost geared towards punishing students who are, really not doing anything wrong.
Well, I'm going to read a little bit from Ms. Gorski's report. She says, snack sales thus represent one instance of how youth experience, quote, criminalized childhoods. Non-criminal student behavior can become stigmatized through a process known as school criminalization, which occurs when adults frame problems and implement solutions oriented around the logic of crime control, thus treating students as potential future criminals. And then she went on to cite studies that show students who are treated this way in schools have a higher likelihood of actually becoming enmeshed in the criminal justice system as they become adults. So to your point, the unintended consequences here are real. These kids are being criminalized for behavior in the high school that they very well are going to become actual criminals. I think you actually said that earlier.
Yeah, I think there's great evidence out there to suggest that there is a, in many cases there's a school to prison pipeline, as some like to refer to it, and that the sorts of activities or the sorts of enforcement and rules that you're giving children is obviously going to be informing them as they become adults. And I think that the paper made a point too of pointing out, and it wasn't Carlos, it was one of the other students whose name I don't recall at the moment, in talking about the situation with the Spanish club, where they were saying like, well, the student was telling Gorski that they can see like, well, okay, if you're a certain type of student, if you're getting good grades, if you're being successful, then you can do this thing that the rest of us are forbidden from doing, and that doesn't seem fair, is how the student described it. And quite frankly, it's not fair. Like, that student has observed something that they will unfortunately probably experience over and over again through the rest of their lives. But that is not a fair way for a system to operate. And then we can't sweep aside the fact, and you mentioned this earlier, but I just want to underline it, that this is a school where 30% of the students are Black, 60% were Hispanic, only about 10% are white. So, I mean, we're dealing with, again, we don't know exactly where the school was, but it's a school in an environment where there are, obviously there's a racial component to what's going on here, because that was the percentages of the students, but most of the teachers predominantly are white women. So there is a dynamic there, and whether it's fair to draw those lines across society in general or not, at least in this microcosm example, you do have sort of a ruling class that is predominantly of one race that is enforcing rules against students of another race that those students recognize as being unfair. And I think there's obviously a lesson to be taken from that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key issues here, is the idea of fairness. When students pick up that things aren't being applied across the board, or there's just a fairness, is something I think we all innately pick up on, and these students for sure did. And this relates to that, and this really bothers me, because this gets to the idea of what we call in the larger economy and in government crony capitalism, where the government is picking winners and losers and making value judgments about what's being sold. When the students were caught selling by teachers and administrators, their motives were subject to, quote, moral scrutiny, Gorski writes. She described an incident in which one teacher told a student that selling snacks to fund for the purchase of new shoes was a poor use of resources. Now, as you just noted, 80% of these students are low-income families. And the average salary, by the way, for these teachers at this school was $100,000 a year. So there's a huge disconnect there. I mean, this is a student who probably really needed that money for the shoes, but she put her own value judgment and said that's not a good use. Who is she to make that kind of judgment? I think that's what really bothers me about this whole case study, is when others try to impose their value judgments. And we see that not just in this case study, but in the larger economy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think you mentioned the example earlier of the football player who was selling snacks and juice on the side because he couldn't work his part-time job during the football season because he's got football practice after school. And so he's trying to find a way to substitute that line of revenue. And this is a way to do it. So again, if you're not being disruptive, if you're not causing problems in class, if you're just doing this in the hallway, I think there's certainly reasonable places where this could happen. And we encourage, entrepreneurial spirit with students. The paper at one point makes the comparison to like Girl Scout cookie selling, right? That like this is lauded, that young women are learning how to be entrepreneurs, how to kind of run their own business, how to make money in it and find fulfillment in that. And then you've got this, it's the exact opposite here, where you're punishing that same sort of inclination. And that is, on one hand, we already talked about how that might encourage students or might actually help students find their way into Black markets later on in life. On the other hand, it might just kill any entrepreneurial sense that they have, right? Or any desire to start their own business or try to make money on their own because, well, I don't know, I tried once and the teacher, threw me in detention. And if I try again, I've got to go get the right permit from the city government. And that's a whole process. So why even bother? I'll just go, find whatever job I can. And so I think this is not the intention of the school. The school is not trying to impart these lessons, but the choices that this school is making, the choices that schools all over this country make every day, are wittingly and unwittingly imparting on students economic lessons like this. And
I think you're
it's ones that the students are going to take with them after they graduate.
That's exactly right. And I think that was what Gorski, that was sort of the focus as she concluded her study, was that students are learning from what's happening in their schools. And I think the lesson they learned from this incident was not a positive one. And I just want to ask you in closing, what do you think that schools, administrators, and teachers can learn from this? What's the takeaway? How can they hear this story and do things differently?
There are so many things that schools should do differently in this country, but I think probably the biggest lesson here is that it's one, and Gorski mentions this in the paper too, that like the desire or the need to encourage students' creativity is really important, because that's ultimately what is happening here too, right? It's an economic lesson, but it's also a lesson about the ways in which kids find spontaneous ways to engage with one another to mutual benefit, which is what's so great about markets all the time. And schools are obviously not set up to encourage creativity. Schools are sort of like factory systems a lot of times, right? You just move along from one class to the next and one grade to the next until you either graduate or fail out. And there's not a whole lot of room for creativity. But to the extent that teachers and educators and administrators can, from this paper, and from broader studies, can include space in the school program to encourage creativity, to allow students to do what they want to do, to direct their own time, especially when they're outside the classroom. I think that's something that can only result in good outcomes. And at the very least, you're going to take away some of the sort of silly and ridiculous punitive actions that are being done in this case study towards students that are obviously not, they're obviously not actual threats in any way.
Right. So I just put up a screen with your story. It was published a few weeks ago. You can go to reason.com. And Eric, for people who aren't familiar with Reason, tell us a little bit about this publication and what sort of your focus is. What do you all write about?
Sure. Yeah. Reason Magazine is a libertarian magazine. We are the magazine of free minds and free markets. So we cover, exactly those things, right? Free markets and the value that they bring to the world, and the problems that are created when government tries to get in the way of the free exchange of goods and services. And we cover free minds in the sense that we like to cover cultural issues that are challenging ideas that are out there, so that, it's not just about, well, we've always done this thing the way we do it, and so, we'll continue that way. So we cover technology, we cover media and movies and films and anything like that, where new ideas are being presented and kind of pushing humanity forward in that regard. And of course, we cover politics too, even though, politics is somewhat hopeless at times.
Well, I just am really grateful for the work that you're doing and bringing these things to light, because I think young people need to be educated more about the markets and capitalism and the benefits of it. So my last question for you, Eric, do you feel hopeful about the future of our country? Do you think young people are learning these things? Where are we going there?
Yeah, it's great that you asked that, because it's great that a story like this is getting attention, because this is not the sort of thing that I typically write. I typically do write about politics, or I write about the national debt, or about entitlement programs that are going to bankrupt us over the next decade. And those are all pretty depressing stories where nobody is really doing the right thing. Nobody's paying attention to the problems that are there. And so I'm very pessimistic about just about anything that politics touches in the world. But I think when you remove politics from the equation, when you let people find their own answers, and when you let people engage in mutually beneficial transactions, the dynamics that emerge from that are always going to be better. And so I love seeing these kids getting to do what they're doing. And I think maybe the best thing in this whole paper, and I mentioned it just at the very end of my story, is that Carlos, the kid we were talking about at the beginning, after he gets busted, and after the next day when the security guards search him, Gorski went to him and said, you're not selling anymore, I guess. You got searched. You don't have any more products. And he just smiles and he says, oh, no, I've got employees doing it for me now. So like he's already moved up to the next level of this game, right? He's already moved beyond the level where the school is capable of shutting him down, because he's got people working for him now, which is the way to go. So this is great, and really appreciate your time, and appreciate the focus that you put on this piece.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thanks for joining us. We really are grateful to all of you who watched, and please check out reason.com. They always have some just really interesting things that teach lessons about the free markets, as Eric was saying. So we will see you next time on another ALEC TV live stream.